Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a second, as I can see folks are just logging in. Thank you for being here. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, even though I know folks are still joining. Welcome to our monthly webinar here at the IIP. My name is Rachel Marshall, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution here at John Jay College. The IIP provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. I'm really excited for today's discussion on ending non-public safety traffic stops, or what's sometimes referred to as pretextual stops. And our panelists bring some great expertise on this topic, so I'm really excited to jump right into it. I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly for the sake of time. We will be putting their full bios in the chat, so you can check those out and learn all about them. But first, it is my honor to introduce Ramsey County Attorney John Choi, who was sworn in in 2011 as the chief prosecutor in Ramsey County, Minnesota, and became the country's first Korean-American chief prosecutor. Since taking office, County Attorney Choi has become a state and national leader in progressive justice reform, working with public officials and impacted communities to reimagine justice and the role of prosecutors. Most recently, John has worked with county law enforcement leaders to reduce reliance on non-public safety minor equipment traffic stops, as we'll be discussing today. As a result, these stops have greatly decreased. Moving violations have increased as a percentage of all traffic stops, and racial disparities for those stops and related searches were reduced by more than half. In addition, a program has been created to, in place of the non-public safety stops, send letters to the vehicle owners and offer financial assistance in making repairs or renewing vehicle registration. So welcome, John. We're happy to have you. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Rushin, who's the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Judge Hubert Lewis Will Professor of Law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. Professor Rushin teaches criminal law, evidence, and police accountability. His research interests include policing, criminal procedure, and criminal sentencing. Cambridge University Press published his book, Federal Intervention in American Police Departments, in 2017. He has served in a variety of advisory roles related to his expertise in criminal justice policy and social science, including a previous gubernatorial appointment as the academic advisor to the Illinois Racial Profiling, Prevention, and Data Oversight Board between 2020 and 2022. Welcome. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Max Carter-Oberstone, who's the Vice President of the San Francisco Police Commission. In 2021, Max was an Orrick Justice Fellow at the Policing Project at NYU Law School, a nonprofit think tank focused on police reform and democratic accountability. There, he drafted model legislation on a range of policing-related topics. He also designed and implemented the Policing Project's Fourth Amendment impact litigation strategies. Before entering private practice, Max was an Associate Deputy Solicitor General at the California Department of Justice, where he litigated appellate matters. Welcome, Max. And finally, I am thrilled to introduce Mike Lee, who's the Executive Director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. He's a born and raised Philadelphian and served for 6 years in the administration of Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner as Director of Governmental Affairs, Supervisor of Adult Diversion, and Chief of Staff. Mike founded and served as Executive Director of Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, a nonprofit legal aid firm that helps Pennsylvanians expunge their criminal records, a program that would later become a model for Pennsylvania's clean slate law. So we have a number of esteemed panelists and really excited for this discussion. Thank you all for being here today. And I want to start with you, County Attorney Choi, to just sort of set the landscape a little bit about this discussion. What is this term that we're using, non-public safety-related traffic stops, or what's sometimes referred to as pretext stops? And in your experience, what is the reason that these stops are ever used?
Well, that's a great question just to frame all of this up. So I think over time, what has happened in policing is there's a tactic that is used in our criminal codes, our penal codes across the country. We're going to have certain things that are illegal. So, for instance, oftentimes it might involve things related to maybe something involving the equipment of your car, or some, like, for instance, an obstructive windshield, a tinted windshield, an expired registration or tab. All of those things are essentially illegal. Nobody ever said that the police should be the ones that enforce that. But what has happened over time is that a method of policing has evolved and been established where you use that violation and then have, under the Supreme Court case of the Wren case, which was a 9-0 decision a long time ago, you can validly pull somebody over and for that violation and then see if there's anything else that might satisfy your suspicion of this particular person or vehicle. And that has come to be known as pretextual traffic stops, or I call them non-public safety traffic stops because they don't relate really to public safety. They're being used for, I think, a different purpose. And we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but that type of policing, the data has said over and over and over again, you can just Google non-public safety traffic stop or pretextual traffic stops. And there is so much research out there that shows that this type of policing, some have called it jackpot policing. You're just on a hunch. And the hit rate on that is very, very low. It's in many studies, it's been less than 2% of actually finding contraband, which is the intent that I think that law enforcement might have. And so I think that's what it is. And so I'll stop there, and I know we'll have a lot more discussion on this.
Yes, we're definitely going to get into all of that research that you just mentioned. Before we dive into some of that, I still want to set a little bit of the landscape. So Mike, I wanted to turn to you to sort of think about who is most impacted by the use of non-public safety related traffic stops, and how do they fit in with the broader history, particularly of racial profiling and other kinds of pretextual policing in the United States.
Good afternoon, Rachel. Thank you so much for organizing today's panel and for allowing me to participate with such experts in the field. And your question about what communities are most impacted, it's unfortunate to give an answer that is given in a lot of different contexts when we're talking about who is being disadvantaged by disproportional negative activity. And it is low-income communities, particularly communities of color. And the history of that goes back pretty much to our nation's founding, and something that I haven't been able to research, but I'm pretty sure once I do, will confirm. But I think about things like the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act and how was that enforced? The only way it was really enforced was to infer that every single African-American you saw in a non-slave state was somehow an escaped slave who needed to be interrogated and investigated. We look out west to just maybe a decade ago when there was, like today, a lot of concern around who is or is not a documented U.S. citizen and the demand to prove your citizenship or ability to stay. And since the Model T was invented, I'm pretty sure there's been an assumption that people of color driving them are no different than people of color who are walking, or no different than people of color who are just trying to live in the United States. And there's a heightened sense of criminality to their everyday behavior. And interestingly enough, when we'll talk about it later, but when a driving equity bill was passed in Philadelphia, the reference cited was that 72% of the stops in Philadelphia were for African Americans, even though the population is only 42%. So that's a good example, and probably true nationwide, of who is impacted by this issue.
Yeah, just really staggering numbers. I want to turn back to something John brought up, which is around the research around this, and turn to you, Professor Russian, to talk a little bit about that piece, because a lot of times as we hear, police officers will justify the use of these kinds of stops because they say they have a hunch that something else is going on, some sort of suspicion. Is that borne out by the research in this area? Do these stops tend to yield recovery of drugs or other kinds of contraband?
Yeah, so I'll reiterate some of the things I think John and Mike were talking about. Generally speaking, the research does not suggest that these kind of minor traffic offenses are an effective way to find contraband or to help conduct other secondary police investigations. So there's been numerous studies on this across numerous jurisdictions of different sizes. And the general gist of the research suggests that when police are empowered to enforce minor technical violations or to act upon pretexts, that the results are twofold. That first off, folks of color are more likely to be stopped in that manner, more likely to be the target, it seems like, of doctrines like Wren and other doctrines that empower the enforcement of minor technical violations. So first off, they are most likely to be targeted. And secondly, when they're targeted, the hit rate of those stops is simply lower than other types of stops. The other thing I would also mention is, we're talking about hunches, we're talking about what an officer may do if they're given the power to make a stop whenever there isn't, for example, reasonable suspicion or probable cause. I think there's both a concern about explicit racism acting, but also just the fact that, implicit bias can operate whenever an officer is empowered to target something based upon a standard lower than probable cause or reasonable suspicion. I think that's also something borne out by the research. And I can talk more about some of the research that I've done personally. For example, a study I've conducted in Washington State on a change in doctrine at the Supreme Court level there that previously prohibited or limited the use of pretextual stops and then permitted the use of pretextual stops. But our findings across 8 million stops were also consistent with what previously Mike and John were talking about.
That's great. In terms of the research, I want to concretize a little bit of this, Max, and turn to you from your perspective. I want to talk about the police commission experience that you have, but before that, given what we just heard, the research that was mentioned, why do you think that so many law enforcement agencies are continuing to use these kinds of stops, given the low yield, as we just heard?
Well, thanks for the question, Rachel, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel today. I think a couple reasons. I think one is just that policing in America today is generally not data-driven. The reason we continue to do pretext stops is because it's based on a myth that was never true, that is somewhat, popularized in culture, that, making traffic stops is this way that we, stop crime. And folks tend to focus on one or two anecdotes as somehow exemplifying a general trend when, as Professor Russian just said, that the data shows just the opposite. I think the second reason is just that, making a big change for some people, I think is a tacit acknowledgement of the failure of all these past decades. And when you talk about leadership at the command staff level in a police department or elected officials, I think they're a little bit hesitant to kind of make this tacit admission that they have been wasting the public's money for all of these years, that they have been needlessly subjecting people of color to increased scrutiny with no public safety upside. And so there's not necessarily a lot of people in leadership super eager to, make that admission, even implicitly. So I think those are a couple of reasons why you see this failed policy persist.
Do you have a sense, Max, of if there's a way to change that, given that reluctance? How do we get some of the responsiveness to this data and this information?
I think that's a hard question. I think the success that I've seen is when you see people in law enforcement talking to other people in law enforcement about this issue. People from outside just don't tend to have the same level of credibility. But, you do have people in law enforcement who have, come to the realization and, that pretext stops are just not a great use of police department's resources. And I've seen the greatest success when those people stand up and talk to people within law enforcement about why policies need to be changed. But that takes a lot of courage and that takes a lot of humility, and not everyone is signing up for that.
Absolutely. County Attorney Choi, I want to return to you for a second, because a lot of times we've talked about sort of how ineffective these stops can be, but they also often cause even greater harm than that. They can lead to real violence and be the start of violent interactions between police and the people that are stopped. And so in your community in particular, that's been very real. as you have all experienced the deadly nature of these kinds of stops through the killing of Philando Castile and right next door in Minneapolis, Daunte Wright. Can you tell us a little bit about, for those who might not know, what happened, particularly in Philando Castile's case, and put it in context around these kinds of stops and the danger that they can lead to?
Yeah, Rachel, thanks so much for that question, because this type of policing, this belief that this type of tactic or police action actually yields public safety actually has led to one of the worst things that's ever happened in my community. It happened on July 6th of 2016. Philando Castile and his girlfriend Diamond Reynolds and Diamond Reynolds' 4-year-old daughter were traveling along a very busy street in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, along Larpenteur Avenue. And as they were driving down that street, a police officer observed Philando Castile driving down the street, and his observation was that he was a person that might resemble a person who had burglarized a convenience store just down the road. Obviously, somebody driving by in a car, you don't have probable cause to pull them over because you think they might have been that person who was involved in a prior crime. So he chose to follow the car. And then he observed that he had the middle light, the back brake light in the middle, in the top of the triangle, was out. And there he had the legal justification to pull over and to make that stop and to investigate further. And that traffic encounter occurred, and immediately within a matter of just seconds, and this is after Philando Castile said in the most calm voice, "Sir, I have to tell you that I have a firearm on me." Somehow he went to 0 to 10 and immediately started shooting. And that traumatic thing that happened in our community to Philando's family, that has in many ways changed us, and it's changed me. And I recognize that we should be trying to prevent these types of situations because they can also lead to deadly encounters, and they don't lead to our public safety. And in addition to a motorist's life, we're also talking about the lives of law enforcement, because we also know that it's these types of traffic stops that can also turn deadly to law enforcement. And so if we don't have to do these stops, if it doesn't actually lead to our safety, right, why do we have to do these things? In fact, who said the police were the ones to enforce the vehicle tabs or the cracked windshields? I mean, quite frankly, I think we've asked police to do too much. I think somebody sitting in the Department of Motor Vehicles could be focusing on expired tabs as an example.
Thank you for sharing all of that and the impact that it's had on your community, and as you said, on some of your views. We've been talking about impact. I want to turn to you, Mike, to talk about some of the impact of these stops generally to folks. Obviously, we heard some horrific examples just now, but more broadly, how do these stops that may or may not end in violence, how do they impact communities more broadly? And if you have any examples or stories, would love to hear them as well.
Sure. And I think it is a real skill to do storytelling in 4-minute bursts. So I'll try my best to keep the conversation going with a story. But the impact is profound. And first and foremost, there's already a learned and shared culture amongst impacted groups of how to survive a traffic stop, right? Like, this is how to leave a traffic stop with your life, because it is that life or death. Police officers also have training over how to begin and end an interaction with their life. And yet, in Philadelphia County, 97% of the stops were for these minor non-public safety related things that, to John's point, has then, once the stop occurs, heightens all of the public safety concerns with that particular interaction. But on the opposite side of Pennsylvania in McKeesport, which is outside of Pittsburgh, in December of 2020, there was an officer involved shooting where a police officer was shot. And for over a week, the police response was aggressive vehicle stops, probably without constitutional justification, for all the residents of color in that vicinity, that left them feeling paralyzed and unable to travel. So some of the impacts could be just anxiety over, how do I travel to and from work? How do I get my kids to and from school? How do I get medicine for myself without having to deal with the potential of entering into a life or death situation based off how I respond to an answer? And we've all had good days and bad days, and just thinking about how easy it could be, and when I'm having a bad morning, to have that bad morning made worse by a stop that I don't believe is justified, or more importantly, isn't really related to the overall public safety of other people, but it's now making me late and at potential of losing my job. But if I don't use the skills I was taught as an African-American man to survive this traffic interaction, I run the risk of being incarcerated for resisting an arrest or otherwise aggravating it. And in worst case scenarios, I run the risk of being killed. And just as plain and simple, getting behind the wheel should not lead to thoughts of the potential of being killed, not by drunk drivers, not by non-public safety traffic stops, certainly, and certainly not by other drivers having these same minor violations that could be resolved through administrative processes.
Thanks, Mike. So, Professor Russian, so what can someone do if they've experienced one of these kinds of non-safety related traffic stops? And we're going to talk in a few minutes about prosecutors and specifically what remedies some prosecutors can pursue around these stops. But let's say you're in a jurisdiction where, you know, there isn't such a policy, there's no police policy not to use these. And so you've experienced one. And as Mike talked about, it had a severe impact or minor impact on you. What can you do? What redress is there?
Yeah, there really isn't much legal redress available to folks who have been targeted for a pretextual stop. So if a person has been targeted for a pretextual stop and that does lead to the enforcement of some other crime, it's unlikely they have much of an option. RIN prevents that. It prevents evidentiary exclusion. It also limits their ability to seek out redress via civil litigation. Beyond that, trying to prove an equal protection violation is exceedingly difficult in those kinds of circumstances. In Wren, that was part of what the court said was available to folks targeted if they believe they were targeted because of their race. But trying to actually prove that, given the data available, is difficult. So really the answer is there aren't many options for redress. Legally speaking, police are within their rights to make stops, even if they are pretextual in nature in most places across the country. I also wanted to mention a couple of other things, I think, that kind of build on some of the things other folks had said. One is about why police want this authority. I think one thing we should mention is that, you know, whenever Wren was handed down, the general concern was not just one of racism or bias, but also a concern that this gave police unfettered power, basically the power to stop anyone. As long as they follow them long enough, they'll find some technical violation, whether that's going 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, whether that's changing lanes without fully turning on their turn signal, something like that. If you follow someone long enough, you can find some technical violation and then use that as a pretext to enforce a hunch or some other suspicion that doesn't otherwise give you the authority to make a traffic stop. Thus, I think the problem here of regulation is really difficult. You have a couple of options for regulation. I mean, one thing you could do is you can do what some jurisdictions have done, and you can, you know, prohibit police from enforcing certain things that you view as non-public safety issues, like seatbelt violations, tinted window violations, brake light violations, recently expired registration. The other option is you can also allow courts to investigate what they view as the subjective or actual justification for a traffic stop, and then have a more blanket general prohibition upon police officers engaging in pretextual traffic stops. So I know we'll be talking more about regulation, but I think those are things I would also mention. One last thing is on officer safety. I think there is increasingly good evidence to suggest that reasonable regulations of police officers' ability to have authority and discretion during traffic stops does not put their safety at risk. This is a common objection you hear from police officer organizations whenever there's a limitation upon traffic enforcement. One of the studies that I recently published with my co-author, for example, looked at a restriction nationally upon the ability of police officers to engage in searches of vehicles incident to arrest. One of the objections made by police organizations was that this would lead to more officers facing public safety risks, more injuries, more deaths. The evidence just does not bear that out. The study that we published last year found that nationally there was no increase, no statistically significant increase in officer safety risk that correlated with that U.S. Supreme Court decision that restricted discretion of officers during traffic enforcement and during searches incident to arrest.
Wow, that's fascinating. Before we kind of turn into some of the policies that have been implemented or being worked on in various jurisdictions, Max, I want to turn back to you for a second to talk about we've talked, and Professor Russian was just talking about the impact on officers or perceived impact on officers. What is the impact of all of this on communities more broadly and the community trust? Because we know that a huge part of safety means having trust in those who are entrusted to keep you safe. So how has all of this impacted community trust in law enforcement more broadly? And is there anything that can be done from your perspective on the police commission to really improve and remedy some of that trust?
Sure. So I don't want to retread the ground that Mike covered, but I think anyone who's been subjected to one of these stops understands the fright and the indignity that arises when it's clear that you're being singled out for disfavored treatment because of your race, and how that affects how you conceive of yourself, how that affects how you conceive of your place in society and in the body politic. And in San Francisco, the disparities are just as striking, if not more than any other jurisdiction. Black people are 10 times more likely to be stopped for an equipment violation. And for the second most popular stop, which is license plate infractions, Black people are 16 times more likely to be stopped. We actually just basically don't stop white people in San Francisco for license plate infractions. I'll say in terms of how it can be remedied, I mean, these things have long-term impacts, but there's been a couple things that have given me some hope. So we invited the former chief of Fayetteville, North Carolina, to speak at San Francisco Police Commission meeting. He implemented a pretext policy in Fayetteville. And one thing that happened is they actually used a lot of those resources towards making some very high profile arrests of drug traffickers with cooperation from federal law enforcement. But the other thing he talked about that he was surprised about is in the aftermath of the policy's implementation at community events, he would consistently have people come up to him, many of them Black, many of them people of color, and talk to him about a positive experience they'd had being pulled over for some type of traffic code infraction. And talk about how the officer explained to them why they were being stopped and was very polite and professional. And the chief would invariably ask, so I take it the officer let you off without a ticket? And the person would almost always say, no, the officer gave me a ticket. I've got a hefty fine to pay. But it was just that change in approach of making stops for things that posed a bona fide threat to public safety on our roadways, and the fact that the officer was no longer using the stop as a springboard to investigate some other crime, that it was genuinely focused on traffic safety, had a pretty immediate impact on how folks in the community related to the police department. So that does give me some hope.
Well, speaking of hope, I want to stick with you for a second, Max, and talk about some of the changes that are happening in San Francisco, in which you played a critical role. Can you tell us about San Francisco's new policy, and sort of talk about how you were able to, and how the city was able to develop it?
Sure. So just briefly, the policy has kind of two main components. The first one is one that Professor Russian just discussed, which is it calls out about 9 infractions from the vehicle code and says that those infractions can no longer be the sole reason for making a traffic stop. And the thing that all of these things have in common is that they were popular infractions to use for pretext stops. And we confirmed with data that they were providing no public safety benefit. So, arrests and discovery of guns were happening at a fraction of a percent for these stops. And we worked with our transportation department locally to confirm that none of these stops were leading to, deaths, crashes, injuries on our roadway. The second thing it does is to place restrictions on what officers can do once a legitimate stop is made. So no more asking for consent to search a vehicle unless there is at least reasonable suspicion of some criminal activity. No more asking investigatory questions unless there is reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. And that's just to disincentivize the whole reason for making a stop in the first instance. Because just addressing nine infractions in a vehicle code with thousands of infractions isn't going to solve the problem. I think to get to the second part of your question, what are some of the challenges we faced? I think they were principally political because the evidence was so overwhelmingly on our side. The police commission is a volunteer citizen body. We all have day jobs. We have no policy staff. We have no money. And so it's very hard to combat some of the coordinated, public relations campaigns put on by, for example, the Police Officers Association, which really just I think it acted exceptionally irresponsibly, had absolutely no fealty to the truth whatsoever in terms of the messaging they put out. Pressure from the mayor of San Francisco, who put a lot of pressure on me privately outside the public's view, not so subtly, first of all, asked me to tell lies about the policy in order to hamstring it. And then when I refused to do that, suggested that, she would accept an undated letter of resignation that I was forced to sign as a condition of my reappointment to the commission. And that practice was ultimately held unlawful by her own, handpicked city attorney. But so there's just a lot of political pressure by folks who, for whatever reason, find it inconvenient to put this policy in place. And it's tough when you don't have the financial means to, really get the message out to the public about why this policy is so beneficial.
Well, we appreciate you sharing all of that information with the public today and with prosecutors across the country and others who are committed to improving the justice system. I want to look at some other jurisdictions as well. We just talked about San Francisco. We're going to talk about Philadelphia in a minute with you, Mike. Virginia is another example of a jurisdiction that has created legislation around this issue. And Professor Russian, can you just give us an overview of some of the different kinds of legislation that you've seen in different jurisdictions to end non-public safety traffic stops, and how have they overall, I know it's hard to generalize with so many different jurisdictions, but how overall have they been in terms of their success rate?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this builds on what Max was just talking about, because it already kind of gives a preview of what jurisdictions across the country have started to do. So trying to regulate pretextual and non-public safety traffic stops is tricky. It's tricky because you have to have officers often say what is the reason for a traffic stop, give that justification. And there's always the possibility officers may not be completely honest, may not reveal the exact reason for a traffic stop. So there's a couple of different models that have been used across the country, one of which is similar to what Max just described. So where you have a city ordinance or a state law or something like that that just directly says these previously legal justifications for traffic stops are no longer things that an officer can say are the reason for a traffic stop. They have to find some other violation of the traffic code in order for them to engage in a lawful traffic stop. That is one option. In jurisdictions where the legislature or the city council or something like that is unwilling to pass such a measure, there's also the opportunity for prosecutors, of course, to step in and to say that we're not going to prosecute, we're not going to take action in cases where it appears to us that an officer is engaged in a pretextual traffic stop. That's a way to kind of work around in a location where otherwise other political actors aren't going to do something. There's also one example that I previously mentioned in Washington State that I've studied at great length, which is we've had at least a few jurisdictions where state Supreme Courts have attempted to regulate pretextual or non-public safety traffic stops by just saying we believe these are violations of our Fourth Amendment version in our Constitution. So in Washington, for example, they previously had a state Supreme Court decision that said that if it appeared an officer engaged in what we would today call a pretextual traffic stop, we're going to say that is a violation of our state constitution, and any evidence acquired thereafter cannot be admitted in criminal courts in our state. Other things that states have done and jurisdictions have done is limit searches incident to arrest for certain types of non-public safety reasons, as well as limiting questioning, et cetera, as Max also talked about.
Thank you for that. Mike, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about Philadelphia and its approach in this area. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the approach that Philadelphia took as a city in trying to reduce these kinds of stops, and then sort of how effective have you seen it play out?
Great questions and also great responses from my co-panelists. And before I forget, Max was just like reminding me of all these other helpful things that I just recalled. And one of the main impacts that this has on communities are legal financial obligations, whether they be fines, fees, costs. Those things are not criminal in nature, and yet police officers can issue them, right? And they can aggregate and lead to things like driver's license suspensions and other types of civil disabilities. And the origins of something like the term outlaw means you live outside the protections of the law. So we are pushing people further out of the protections of our government through actions like this, while not making us any safer. And then the second thing is, one of the times I was pulled over, it was for not having my lights on, but it was still so bright out that the officer was wearing sunglasses. So I followed the complaint procedures. First, I had to pay or fight the ticket. So two ways in which it would cost me money. Ultimately, I filed a civil complaint against the officer, and it was justified. That stop was justified was so demoralizing to me as a trained attorney and just as a person that my liberty could be that easily taken away that someone could make up the fact that I'm a public safety risk by not having lights on while you're still wearing sunglasses. So it just really fostered a lot of distrust in the entire system, all the way through the accountability of the officer who I believed wronged me. But not my story alone, but the story of thousands of Philadelphians. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this happened after George Floyd and civil unrest around racial injustice in America. We finally got the political courage to make a change. And that change was similar to what Max described in San Francisco, where there are 8 enumerated, quote unquote, minor offenses that officers should no longer use as the primary reason to stop a car. They can still pull you over for speeding, for overly tinted windows, for any other enumerated things that they would like to effectuate their jobs. And the companion legislation was requiring data to be collected and analyzed that I believe was modeled very closely off of some of our litigation around stop and frisk for pedestrians. We had a very similar type of racial disparity of 71% of pedestrian stops were African Americans, 72% of vehicle stops are African Americans. So I think the racial disparities are consistent with all these police interactions. And what we've seen so far in Philadelphia is the denominator has gone down. So there's fewer vehicle stops, there's fewer pedestrian stops, but the racial disparities and the difficulty of that equal protection clause still exist. So fortunately, fewer people are being subjected to this randomness of government intrusion, but unfortunately, it's still disproportionately impacting people of color. And I bet if we drill down, it would impact people of color in specific communities within Philadelphia. Thank you.
Mike, sorry, it's a tough question, but do you see, in spite of this, as you described, when there's the racial disparities still persist, do you see a way to address that specifically with this legislation?
To address racial disparity through legislation?
Just to follow up, the number of stops have been reduced, but if the racial disparities are still persisting, what are some ways that can be addressed as you see it? Or can it be?
I honestly don't know if it can be, especially when we start to see through the collection of accurate data. And that's another issue that we have with this whole reform movement, is that oftentimes the data collector is the data subject, which would be the arresting officer, and how you write the report, how you, the officer, identify my ethnicity or my race impacts a lot of things from what we can see. So one of the main ways we could move forward is first making performance measurements for police officers, not just centered on people that they detain or arrest, but also having some more neutral ways to collect data and have more ways for people to self-identify and self-report. So I might present as African-American, but identify as another race or ethnicity. And statistically speaking, for all these reform efforts, it could be getting lost in the shuffle. But I don't know if there's any type of legislation or training that could properly address these types of racial biases that we're seeing in many different forms of police interactions.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's a good segue to start to pivot to talking about what can prosecutors do. We have a lot of prosecutors on this meeting today with us who are eager to learn how they can limit the harms of these kinds of stops. So I want to turn to you, County Attorney Choi, because you have such a policy in your office. Can you tell us about that policy and the approach that you have implemented in your jurisdiction, and how you went about even developing it to begin? I'm sorry, County Attorney, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. This issue actually started because of some of the work and connection that I had with the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution and with Vera. Both IIP and Vera had a joint project called Reshaping Prosecution. And as a part of that project, in terms of engaging prosecutors around the country, we were thinking about how the prosecutor could be a part of transformational types of reform. And I remember it was pre-pandemic, it was 2019. We were in New York at John Jay College, and Jeff Robinson from the ACLU was one of the presenters, and he talked about this issue. And then he put out on the table, can prosecutors play a role by simply saying this, that the prosecutor does not want to participate in this unjust police tactic, and that we could actually say out loud that we would increase the constitutional protections for all people in our communities, right? And I remember we went around the table and there was a bunch of other elected prosecutors there, and it was my turn to, because the question was, can you implement this in your community? And I had a big gulp and I said, maybe. But I went back to my community and we started having some conversations. And what I learned is that we had massive disparity in people who were subjected to these types of equipment violation traffic stops, these non-public safety traffic stops. In fact, Black motorists were subject to these types of stops 4 times more than white motorists, and subjected to searches 9 times more. And through a series of just conversations, also too, I think Mike talked about maybe some elected officials got some additional courage after the murder of George Floyd, which happened across the river. But through a number of conversations, I actually was able to get some of my police agencies, not all of them. I have 9 police agencies in my jurisdiction, and the 3 largest ones were willing to join on to say that we would move away from these types of traffic stops and encourage more moving violations, the things that actually matter to our public safety, and that, like for speeding, careless driving, DWI, and that we wanted to address the racial disparity head on, to say that out loud. And then I would have a policy in my office working in conjunction with all of the guidance and the changes in tactics that the three agencies employed. That we would move away. My policy is very simple. We identify 6 types of equipment violations: vehicle registration, window tint, muffler noise, windshield, cracked windshield, obstruction of windshield, non-functioning lights, but just one of them, not both of them, and not having license plate illumination. And that if there was a case sent to me and that was the reason for this original stop, then we would not, the presumption would be we would not prosecute that case. But we do have a public safety exception that we have utilized, but it certainly is an exception. And that was launched in September of 2021. We also launched an alternative, which would allow for the police officer to enter into the system, what they observed. Maybe it's a broken taillight. That would go into the CAD system, and then the police department could generate a letter saying that your vehicle was observed to have a broken taillight. If you contact us, we can get you a lights on coupon, which would then pay for the broken taillight. And we launched in September of 2021. And we have massively reduced the racial disparities in these traffic stops. We have shifted in the aligned jurisdictions that implemented this change. They've had massive change from emphasizing more of the moving violations and less of the equipment violations. In fact, in the year after the policy was enacted, you had a reduction of, it went from 25% of all traffic stops were equipment related. And then after, it was 5% for the participating jurisdictions. We also reduced racial disparity, 66% for African Americans. And we also had the Justice Innovation Lab, research all of this change. And they also came to the conclusion that we did not negatively impact public safety at all. In fact, some of the crime rates increased more in non-participating jurisdictions within my county. And I think Max was talking about having the former chief from Fayetteville talk a little bit about his journey. It very much inspired us, and that I can say for certain that we've had the same experience of people coming up to law enforcement or to me or to people that work in my office about the gratitude that we've for doing this type of approach and having this program, and the thank you letters that people send to the police department about the fact that they didn't get a ticket, but they instead they got a coupon. Has changed, I think, just the way that we're just showing up and having these types of conversations, these difficult conversations about race. And you can, I think, if we want things to change, we have to take head on and have conversations about racial injustices and these racial disparities. We can admire all of this data and say that it's too big to change. But if we don't change it, we're going to continue to have injustices. I think the status quo in this country for too long has been that Black and brown families have had to adapt to what's been happening to them in terms of how they are being policed. And so we talked about how people and families will have this talk about how to behave when you're pulled over. We will never have a justice system that is worthy of its name unless the system recognizes that the changes should not be coming from families in our communities. It should be coming from our systems that we need to change. We need to follow the research and the data and recognize that this type of policing, this way of enforcing the law has done more to a bigger disservice to justice in our country. And until we can reckon with that, we will have these repeated patterns of injustices across this country.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that Noah from our team just dropped in the chat some more information about some of the work of your office in this area. And thank you for sharing all of that. Just to get a little bit into the weeds a little bit more on it, how do you, and this is a question we ask a lot when talking about prosecutorial policies, how do you ensure implementation with line attorneys in this policy?
Just checking the data. Right. So we have so like, for instance, I have the data like handy. We've had since we launched this in September of 2021, we've had 176 cases that had some aspect of traffic related to it in terms of like a subsequent felony or something else that happened. And of those 176, there were 22 cases in which our policy was implemented or implicated because it had one of those equipment violations. And of those 22 cases, we have declined 15 of them. So 7 of them have come in through the public safety exception. But I know that the change is also occurring not just because of the data, but also because I know that the police chiefs that are participating in this effort, they know when they hear from their officer, and I got a lot of pushback, by the way, and so did our police leaders for making this change. But oftentimes the police chief or the higher commander or somebody who normally would call and complain about trying to get a public safety exception or something along those lines, they're self-regulating themselves, and they know when they look into a situation and they see clearly that there's no other basis, there's no reason, there's no public safety exception that could be made. They're not even making the request anymore, which I think is a good thing. So this is not just, I think, within this office, but also within the participating police agencies as well, is that they're recognizing this is kind of how they do it, and they're showing up and talking about this more publicly and releasing videos and things like that. So I think that's a good thing where people are starting to buy in. Usually it starts with the leadership. And I know that it's always tough because you can always have policies, but you're not going to change much unless the culture changes. And I think that's a longer term process, but we can only just check to see how things are, changing. And we can also check in with our community as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think particularly on that last point that you made about checking in with the community, Mike, I wanted to ask you if you have thoughts about how prosecutors' offices can interact and collaborate with the community in thinking about policies or approaches to non-public safety related traffic stops.
I was just enamored with that story of cooperation and wish that not just the city I live in, but every city could have such awesome examples of leadership and problem solving. And it's challenging because when you start talking about communities and it's plural, there are competing interests. And I think that the distinction that I heard lifted up quite a few times of a moving violation that could potentially impact public safety by the vehicle somehow hitting someone or some object versus a technical violation, which is no matter how long that registration is expired, it's not going to, in and of itself, harm someone or some property, is a really good way to frame the conversation for community input in policymaking. And I think that unpacking this idea around the connection or coupling of public safety and traffic stops is really important. And the evidence is already there because we have many communities we can point to that don't have these same level of traffic stops and also feel very safe, right? And how are we policing traffic in those communities that's so different in these other communities, and what lessons can we learn? So I think it'd be important to bring in impacted communities, obviously, and build similar to what John and Max were talking about in terms of getting the buy-in from the bottom, that the root cause of the public safety in this instance is the traffic stop and not the reason for the stop. And once you flip those two things, I think it becomes easier to problem solve around alternatives like I love the idea of helping people financially get the repair before holding them accountable for not doing so, and identifying those other socioeconomic factors that are so closely connected to things like police interactions to begin with.
Thanks, Mike. I want to kind of, I guess, take a little bit of some of the law enforcement perspective that we often hear and ask you, Max, what do you say to police officers who say, look, this is a part of my job. These are this is part of my proactive policing, and I'm doing this with the intent of promoting safety. What is your response to officers who may say that, or to anyone who might say that?
Sure. I mean, I think the first level response is just to familiarize the officer with data from the local community showing that, these stops are actually not effective at stopping or preventing crime in any way, and that their time would be much better served on an array of other strategies that are proven to stop crime. But I'll also say maybe what not to do, which is a mistake that I learned the hard way myself, where, when I initially rolled out this policy, I focused a lot on talking about the race disparities, because I think that's an important part about this. I think it's important that we have, a moral and constitutional obligation to treat everyone equally under the law. But obviously, there's two reasons to do this policy. There's the race part and there's the public safety part. And I found that starting with the race part of this, or emphasizing the race part of this, what officers end up hearing is, you're calling us all racist. And that's what you're really saying here. And then you have to get into, well, I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying, we all have implicit bias in every profession. It's just the way it manifests in policing has very acute consequences because of the responsibilities that police have. And so I spent a lot of time kind of repairing the damage that I inadvertently did at the outset by not being more thoughtful about the way I talked about race, and also about the degree to which I emphasized it relative to the other benefits of the policy.
So I want to turn to you, Professor Russian, to you've mentioned some of the research that we've been talking about, and County Attorney Choi just mentioned some of the studies and research that was done on your office's policy. Can you give us some more sense of some of the independent studies that have looked at this issue and how they have found this connects to public safety? So we heard an example of the analysis in St. Paul, but I'm hoping you can kind of put a national context on that a little bit.
Sure. And before doing so, I also wanted just to highlight a couple of things that I think were really important to add to this conversation. One was, I think, a point made, I think it was Mike earlier, talked about the difficulty in verifying the accuracy of race and underlying data that we're using with these kind of studies. And I really want to highlight that is actually a very critical point for someone like me that's trying to do like independent empirical analysis of data like this. It's challenging because in a lot of jurisdictions, the data on the race of the drivers is provided and self-reported by officers who conduct the traffic stop. And that makes it difficult from a researcher's perspective because, officers may have a self-interest in not reporting the race, for example, of the person that they stop, or misreporting the race of the person that they stop to hide what they view as a possible pattern of targeting folks of color. And there's actually evidence to support that this has happened in some jurisdictions, both in the economic literature in Texas, as well as in some of the jurisdictions I personally looked at. So in one jurisdiction I looked at, we saw that when there was a restriction upon officer discretion that could potentially provide a greater benefit to folks of color, there was then an underreporting of the race of drivers that were stopped in the months that followed that change. So I think that is a really important issue, and it really does make it difficult for researchers like myself to always know how accurate the studies that we're doing actually are. Second thing I wanted to mention is something I think Max talked about, which is when I teach this, I also find that even working with students, folks who are going to be attorneys in the near future, it's sometimes difficult if I frame it just as a matter of race at the outset. Instead, I often frame it as a matter of discretion. What kind of discretion do we want to give officers? And then what is the consequence of giving such extensive discretion, given everything that we know about implicit bias? As for research, I think I'm best positioned probably to talk about my own studies that I've done in this area that I think speak most to this particular issue. So one study I conducted with a co-author was published about 3 years ago, and I've already mentioned it once. This had to do with the effects of a change in policy in Washington state. So in 1999, the Washington State Supreme Court held in State versus Ladson that their state constitution barred something equivalent to like pretextual stops. And then in 2012, they eased this restriction in a later state Supreme Court case. So my co-author and I looked at over 8 million traffic stops conducted by the Washington State Patrol between 2008 and 2015. We did a couple of different styles of analysis here, but we basically had two core findings. The first finding was that whenever we looked at these 8 million plus traffic stops, and we looked at the period where the state law changed to permit something equivalent to pretextual or non-public safety traffic stops in greater amounts, that the folks who were increasingly targeted were by and large drivers of color. Specifically, Black and Latino drivers were disproportionately targeted for greater enforcement of minor violations. That was one analysis that we did. Second analysis that I think helped us kind of reaffirm these findings had to do with the data giving us the time of day when the traffic stop actually occurred. And we think this is important because if you know the time of day, and you can also look up like the degree to which it's light outside versus dark, you can do something called like a veil of darkness analysis. And what we found was that the increased targeting of drivers of color occurred primarily during daylight hours, when in theory officers would be more able to identify the race of a passing driver. And there wasn't that increase in targeting of drivers of color at night, whenever it would be potentially more difficult to identify someone's race. So we think that's consistent with the general theory that allowing pretextual traffic stops contributes to the targeting of folks of color disproportionately. And the second study that we did that was just recently published had to do with something a little bit different than pretextual traffic stops, but something really closely related. And that has to do with searches incident to arrest. And to be very brief, what that basically found was that as the US Supreme Court began to restrict searches incident to arrest, and because searches incident to arrest were so closely tied to the use of pretextual stops, the beneficiaries across a data set of 42 million traffic stops appeared to be particularly drivers of color. Those were the folks who were less likely to be stopped. After the US Supreme Court handed down its decision in Gantt, they appear to be less targeted for stops and then less targeted for the enforcement of searches incident to arrest relative to their white counterparts.
Thanks. And we'd love to, I know there were a lot of studies just mentioned. I saw some requests in the chat. We'll send out links to some of those in our post webinar email, where we also send out the link to this entire recording, as I know some folks are trying to take notes. So you'll be able to watch it in slow and pause it as you see fit. I want to take some of that back to our hypothetical prosecutor, or maybe our real prosecutors watching today. And I'll start with you, County Attorney Choi. What do you say to the prosecutor, many of whom would say, look, I am very concerned about guns in my community. I am very concerned about fentanyl or other kinds of drugs in my community. And if one of these stops helps get a gun off the street before it hurts somebody, or it keeps a batch of fentanyl from hurting or leading to overdoses, then I'm sorry, that's a risk I'm willing to make. What do you say to prosecutors or others who may take that approach?
Well, I think the first thing is that to get guns and fentanyl off our streets, we're not going to do that necessarily through traffic stops. In fact, the data, as we have been talking about, it's not that effective. And we've talked about how this type of policing can actually further and exacerbate distrust with the criminal justice system, as well as with policing. All of those factors, and recognizing that the contraband hit rate is typically 1 or 2%. In my jurisdiction, when they did the study and looked at the data from in Ramsey County, it was less than 2%. So if that's the type of effectiveness that you're going to get, I mean, if I was a basketball player, I wouldn't be on the court if you're shooting at that type of rate. So I think the first thing is you have to recognize that you have power at the front door of the justice system. You can prioritize certain things. You can say that you wish to increase the level of constitutional protection that we wish to give to our officers. You want to not have certain things done under your name because you're participating in that type of policing that if you come to that conclusion that it's unjust, you're just exacerbating it. Now, at the same time, I think that prosecutors, when they do this type of this type of policy, the first thing is you should try to work with your law enforcement partners if that's possible. I know that in many jurisdictions that can be very challenging or very difficult. In fact, I don't know of any other prosecutor policy that works in conjunction with other police policies or guidance or changes that they have made. I think the second piece of it too is that you should have an exception, because what if you find that person that is, has just like a trunk load full of fentanyl or whatever it might be. So you have that option to evaluate the public safety type of issue. But at the same time, it's really important that the exception never takes over the rule, and that you're making sure that you have a clear delineated message to kind of what comes in that front door, is that these cases we're not interested in because we think it has a negative impact. And of course, if you have that buy-in. So part of that is just, it's having those conversations and building up that coalition, and that includes community as well. And having some of the tough conversations with community who might think this is a bad idea. But I think once people start thinking about and seeing the data, and also recognizing this concept that we've asked police to do way too much, and that we needed to start actually thinking about different types of responses. And I keep talking about the fact that like a lot of the stuff is administrative, and there is a state agency or some other body that could be regulating people who don't renew their tabs. But that's a very common equipment violation that we see coming in over and over.
Thanks so much. I guess I want to turn to kind of a different angle of sort of the same question, and I'll direct it to you, Mike, which is, other prosecutors might say, look, I get it, but it's also bad optics for me, or they might think it's bad optics to be out there saying, I'm telling the police how to do their job, or that I'm going to limit any part of how police approach parts of their job. That's not going to go over well in my community where crime is a real concern. So how would you advise those prosecutors to navigate it? It's almost like a messaging question a little bit.
Great question. And I love messaging and narrative work because I think it is an important component to the ultimate goal, which is changing someone's behavior. In this case, it's the officer's behavior. And like the way we decouple it is first by going after this idea of what makes us safe. And I don't know if there's any research, maybe Professor Rushing can tell me, but I don't think people of color drive more than other race or ethnicities. I don't think they drive more recklessly than other race or ethnicities. And I don't think they drive with more technical violations on their vehicles than other race or ethnicities. However, across the country, they're pulled over more, and then by extension, being associated with something that makes us less safe. So I think this is much more another manifestation of trying to control population than it is about keeping the roads safe. And if it's about keeping the roads safe, then we can do non-law enforcement things like if a road has trouble with speeding, you can have speed humps, you can have potholes, you can have traffic lights, or the cameras that are able to read your license plate, like the Easy Pass or whatever your state's turnpike payment system is. Another thing is that not all guns are transported by car. Not all drugs are transported by car. So the more we allow the narrative of these traffic stops are just imperative to our overall public safety, the more it gives a pass to people who are criminal intent, who might realize that if I don't transport these drugs in a car, I'm much less likely to get stopped because the overemphasis is on vehicle and vehicle operations. So I think that decoupling this idea really is centered on the fact that if it's about the moving violations, we have the technology and resources to do it almost automatically without any human resource. And if we do want to use human resource and capital, then we can have things like crossing guards get expanded powers and responsibilities. If we do want people going around regulating whether or not your registration is current, I'm sure there are much less intrusive and expensive ways we can do that. That frees up, again, to Max's point, the officer's time and attention to other more important matters.
Thank you. We're going to get to questions in just a second. But before that, I want to ask you, Max, kind of where do we go from here? Sort of where does the future, as we continue to gather more research, where would you like to see prosecutor policies and other changes in this area? How would you like to see them evolve and go further?
You know, I think I'd love to see more action at the state level, where generally state legislatures are vested with the power to make changes to the exclusionary rule, which I think is the most powerful incentive here to actually get compliance from officers. I think, you know, policies look at the local level, like the one here in San Francisco, is great, and there the incentive is just officer discipline. But I think there's nothing like the exclusionary rule to make people see the light, in terms of why this is not a great use of time. I think that's one thing. Although we already have kind of mountains of data and academic papers, I am eager to see analyses of kind of this newer second generation of policies that are being implemented now. We've got some preliminary data out of Virginia. You know, the Los Angeles policy, I don't think has really been studied thoroughly. I think we've got a kind of a diversity of approaches that have been taken in recent past. So I'm actually very curious to see kind of the variations in outcomes that we can maybe attribute to different facets of the policies that have been recently implemented.
Thank you. And before we turn to some questions that have come in, I just wanted to give each of you an opportunity to kind of give your last word, your last pitch, anything that you'd like our audience and particularly prosecutors on this message to take away, or a lesson that they should learn from this conversation. And I will start off with you, County Attorney Choi.
Well, I'll just say that I also think that, you know, not one size fits all. So I think there is a spectrum of kind of how this type of reform can look like and feel like in a particular community. It could be one that is done by the police chief because they have discretion and they certainly can do what they think is consistent with what their community's values are. It can be done in cooperation. I think it'd be more powerful with the prosecutor. I think the state legislature is also a great place, but I think what I find is that it gets into the politics, and this issue I have found very candidly falls into this culture war that we are in. We believe that things have to be this way or that way. It's kind of like an or. And I think in terms of how to navigate these difficult conversations, it's recognizing that there's many options that can work, but we have to follow the data and the research. And I think that practical research too, outside of the academic research, but just looking at some of the changes that have been made and to show the practitioners in the field that when you make these changes, it doesn't have a negative impact on public safety, that the hit rate for this type of policing is not effective, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that showing this over and over again, especially as it relates to the reforms that are starting to happen, is a good approach to study all the various things that are happening. And I know that what they continuously will find is that the hit rate will always be low and the impact to public safety would be negligible. You can't do a causal type of relationship. Yeah, but they will also, I hope we'll do qualitative research because I think they will find in communities, especially those that are most impacted by policing, that the levels of trust will improve. And at the end of the day, that is the most important thing. If we want our institution of policing to be strong, it has to be legitimized by all people in a community. And so there's, I think, more work to be done in that area around research and connecting some of that, this conversation to the data.
Mike, I'll turn to you next. Any quick takeaways that you want to give our audience?
I'll be as brief as possible, and I'll just talk about America, right? Great country, I love it, and we're very much committed to freedoms. And one of the first freedoms we share collectively is your first bicycle, right? The freedom to bike all over your neighborhood, see different friends, and not be relying on someone else for a ride. And your second freedom, your freedom of adulthood, is generally your first car. But if that freedom of having that car, which is so American, we have the most cars in the world, is also conditioned on the color of your skin, then we not really fulfilling our American dream. And I think that the pretending that public safety is made better, I, as a member of public, am made better by giving up part of my freedom to drive the car like all the other people in the country who might not feel like they're 72% more likely to get pulled over, then it really harms my ability to love the country as much, care for it as much, and participate in other forms of civic engagement and crushing legal costs. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Mike. Max, I'll turn to you next.
Sure, maybe two quick takeaways for me for folks considering implementing a policy to regulate pretext stops. I think the first is the importance of community engagement, both to add legitimacy to any policy that's ultimately adopted, but also just we learned so much from talking to people. In San Francisco, we did the most comprehensive public outreach campaign in the modern history of the police commission, which is over a century old. And I'll just give a couple examples. Sometimes it's small stuff, simple stuff, but important things, like an original draft said that you could not make a stop solely because a car only had one of two license plates. And the police commission, none of us have been police officers who have actually had to enforce our traffic laws. An officer pointed out something that maybe should have been obvious, which is he said, well, that means if I pull up behind a car and there's no license plate, I then have to switch lanes, speed ahead of them, and see if they have a front license plate before I know whether I can make a stop or not. That seemed like a legitimate, gripe. So we changed it to, if you have a rear license plate, then you can't be stopped. Another quick example is we were initially going to put riding non-motorized bikes and scooters on the sidewalk as a de-emphasized offense. Folks from the disabled community reached out and were not happy with this and described how in San Francisco, they basically have to brave a gauntlet of these wheeled, non-motorized vehicles just to go about their day. And it's actually really dangerous and stressful for them. So we removed that. The second thing I would say is that one of the biggest things we have on our side is that we have the evidence and data on our side. So when you shape the policy, it also has to be informed by data. So, when you de-emphasize a stop, you have to make sure that the data supports it doesn't have any public safety benefit. So we had tinted windows on an initial draft. We took it off because it turned out that while it wasn't like a gold mine for finding guns and drugs, it happened at a marginally higher percentage than the other stuff on the list. I have no idea why that is, but we took it off. Same for the traffic safety component. We worked with our transportation department so we could say, there have been 0 deaths, crashes, or injuries resulting from these stops. And that's something really powerful to be able to say. Sometimes there were things on the list that seemed like they wouldn't cause crashes, but it ended up that they did. And I'm glad that we had the data so that we could remove them. So those would be my 2 takeaways.
Thank you. Professor Russian, last takeaway.
Yeah, so I have 3 very quick takeaways. One is that I would say, first takeaway is that the empirical research in this space thus far is largely consistent. And it seems to suggest that reasonable regulations on pretextual or non-public safety traffic stops probably doesn't impact public safety and almost certainly reduces racial disparities in the places where it's been studied. Second big takeaway is that I don't think there is a perfect or ideal model that has to be used to achieve this policy end. There's lots of different experimentation and models being used across the country. And third, I would say, because of that experimentation, there's really an opportunity here for more research. And I think more research is the best tool that we're going to have to advocate for these kind of policy changes. From the researcher's perspective, any single study, including my own, can be easily discounted by critics because of concerns about like proper baseline, the accuracy of the specific data set. For example, did officers properly report the race of drivers in that data set, the particular empirical model adopted, et cetera. But more studies showing the same thing using different models and slightly different approaches to their laws help folks respond to those types of critics and make it more difficult to discount the effectiveness of these policies as a whole.
And I know we've had a lot of requests for some of the studies that are out there to be shared. We will do that in our follow-up email. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to take a couple of quick questions and I'll open them up to anyone who wants to take them. One is, there's been an increased amount of political scrutiny of progressive prosecution. How do the panelists navigate this? Are they getting flack for curbing pretextual stops? Maybe County Attorney Choi, it makes sense to direct this to you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, clearly, for me, this was probably the most controversial thing that I did, but I just spoke from my heart and led with research and transparency. And I remember back in September of 2021, even despite the fact that St. Paul Police Department, which was my largest police agency, and the Roseville Police Department announced that they had already, they made these changes along with me. I felt the brunt of it all. And so there was just an enormous amount of pushback. I think the legislature was then motivated to, have hearings and focus on my office. But, since we publicly released the research in September of 2023, I feel like a lot of that has abated. And it's just staying with this conversation and, working with police leaders to try to get them to be more out in front on this issue. It's hard for them as well. Because they have a culture as well that they're trying to manage as well, but they also are committed to this type of change and then doing that community engagement. And I think for the most part, I think community is happy when they feel like all aspects of our community feels a sense of justice or some improvement. It was one of the most important things that was said at the press conference when back in September of 2021, when we first launched this. And I know it was kind of a surprise to our community, but we had the president of the African American Leadership Council, Tyrone Terrell, was there, and he was there to support this new policy. And I got a question right out of the chute from one of the reporters, and she said, isn't this a disrespect to the men and women who work in the police department, and how this is going to be a negative impact on public safety. And this is before the research and all of that. But Tyrone Terrell grabbed the microphone and he said something really compelling, which was, it's my community that suffers most from the violent crime, and we're subjected to these types of traffic stops, and we're asking you for this change. We want to see, when we think it will lead to safer communities. And if we can tie in, and that's kind of what I think what we're trying to work towards, is that we're working for safety, and we're also listening to communities that have been impacted. We will never have a justice system that is worthy of its name unless we listen to those that are most impacted, the most marginalized. And we have a pattern and a practice in this country where we don't do that. And so I think to enhance the quality of justice, we need to actually put those values into action.
Thank you. Last question I think we'll take. I'll open this up to anyone who wants to take it. It's a longer question that says, separate from being used as fishing expeditions or springboards to starting investigations, pretextual stops can be used as a cover for stops that are actually not pretextual, but are in fact supported by significant probable cause. Frequently, large, long-term narcotics investigations are protected by using the cover of a pretextual stop when a low-level conspirator is arrested. Has any research been done on how the loss of that cover might affect these larger investigations? Though a policy against true pretextual stops would not prevent the use of this tool, it would make it much easier for the arrested conspirator to conclude that a larger investigation was already underway.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. We discussed this in closed door meetings with command staff. My sense is that this wasn't happening at a particularly high rate, but I think it's like a very valid thing to raise. And at least under our policy, those stops will be permitted, because our policy says that if there is even reasonable suspicion, not even probable cause, for a non-traffic related crime, the stop can be made. Now, the problem that the questioner is raising is you don't want the driver to know the real reason for the stop. But our policy doesn't require that the real reason be provided. All that it requires is that there be this bona fide, some shred of evidence supporting criminal activity outside the traffic stop. So in San Francisco, these stops can continue to go ahead unabated when our policy takes effect.
Great.
I have a comment for that as well. As a former member of law enforcement, and now happily part of the ACLU family, it again goes to the problem with the narrative of the best way to catch the kingpin is through these low-level minor offenses. So let's do 100,000 of the minor offenses, right? And if it is as targeted as this hypothetical suggests, I'm still uncomfortable with it. And as a non-member of law enforcement, I would be opposed to this type of investigation and prosecution. However, if that is what law enforcement believes is best, then I would have faith in our criminal legal system to fetter out the details. But the idea, going back to the best way for us to protect this investigation or get the person supplying our community with drugs, is by having tens of thousands of minor infractions be enforced with the hopes that one of them is connected to this. Or conversely, if we don't do these thousands of other ones, then this pretextual stop sticks out again because it would be the only one. So like the fault with the question is really around, to me, why are we centering these investigations and leveraging them based off of non-public safety pretextual stops? And to quote a colleague on this panel, for us to have the legal system live up to its name, we need investigations that are more comprehensive and not hinging upon low-level offenses from low-level conspirators in that direct sense.
I think we'll have to end it there. I want to thank all of you. This was really a fascinating and informative discussion. I've learned so much. I hope everyone watching has as well. I really want to thank each of you for giving your time and expertise to this discussion. As I mentioned earlier, we will be posting this online shortly, and you can watch the entire clips. We'll also send out some of those links. We may follow up with some of our panelists to make sure we have them all. But we really want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for watching. We do host monthly webinars, so sign up at prosecution.org to be a part of our listserv and get notified if you're not a member already. And we will be with you soon. But thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.